This video documents the journey of finishing our first live edge project and how we went from raw slabs to a functional and beautiful finished product for our home. We started with two 8-foot rainbow poplar slabs we purchased from Matt at M2 Lumber in Lawrence, South Carolina, and after a lot of trial and error and hard work, ended up with something we love. First on the list of tasks was to get the slabs mocked up for the substructure using cardboard cutouts and then cleaned up. Because the wood was punky in some places, I used a nylon bristle brush and a drill to scrub the dirt off the edges and out of the knots. The first of many sanding sessions was next. This was in an effort to get the surface smooth and clean, which would aid the penetrating epoxy while being absorbed into the wood. A hand brush and vacuum removed the debris left over from the cleaning and sanding. We selected Total Boat penetrating epoxy as our stabilizer and hardener. The epoxy mixture ratio was 2:1 with the option of using a thinner. We used denatured alcohol as a thinner at a 2:1 ratio of the total mixture of epoxy. Due to thorough sanding and cleaning, the thinned penetrating epoxy went on smooth and easy with a single-use bristle brush. The thinned penetrating epoxy took to the wood very well, and we ended up putting 7 coats on each side with at least 48 hours between each coat. This is after a total of 14 coats were applied with ample time to dry. A lot of the epoxy was sitting on top of the wood now as it was unable to absorb anymore. This is what we were looking for and waiting for. I sanded the penetrating epoxy left on the surface of the rainbow poplar with 80 grit 3M extract Cubitron 2 discs. Next was mock-up of the slabs on the substructure. We placed the slabs on top of the framing and carefully marked the lines and orientation of the slabs. We used a clamped straight edge, a 60-tooth blade, and a circular saw to make the miter cuts. After the miter cuts were completed, we needed to address the cracks. I used this bow tie inlay that we bought from M2 Lumber as a guide since this was my first time attempting an inlay and securing cracks in a slab. We thought cherry inlays would accent the rainbow poplar nicely. I milled some slats from a cherry log. The log came from a tree we felled last year. Using the M2 Lumber inlay as a guide worked quite well, and I became more comfortable with the process as I made several inlays. Having access to a bandsaw made milling the slats and cutting out the bow ties rather simple. I built a sanding disc for my lathe and used it to smooth the surfaces of each inlay and make sure they were straight. Because the sanding disc could not reach the inner corner of the inlay, I used a 3-sided file to clean them up. I learned this trick during my studies at YouTube University. Basically, you find the location for the inlay, put some painter's tape down, and then use some CA glue to hold the inlay down. Use a marking knife to cut the painter's tape, which will give you clear and defined lines of where the edge of the inlay is at on the workpiece. I then set the router depth stop for the inlay. Cutting out the material for the inlay to fit in was next. I was pretty nervous about this because I was cutting a big hole in our beautiful slab. This was the underside though, so there was a bit of room for error. The cut could have been cleaner with a down spiral bit, but I was going to use a chisel on the edges anyway, so that didn't bother me. I cleaned up the interior corners a bit before moving on. With the tape removed and a test fit of the inlay, I put a slight chamfer on the edges to allow for easy installation and a bit of room for the glue. With a bit of persuasion from a block of wood and a hammer, the inlay fit nice and snug. I sanded the inlay down to match the surface of the workpiece. I finished a few more and started feeling pretty comfortable with it. Next was the final mock-up before the finishing touches and zip bolts were installed. I used some fish wave cutter Forstner bits to create the holes for the zip bolts. I used a 1/2 inch straight cut bit to cut the groove between the holes. Based on the markings from the mock-up, I took a lot of time and made sure the measurements were right before cutting into the slabs. The Forstner bits did a good job at creating the flat bottom holes required for the zip bolts. After checking the depth, I moved on to the second hole that needed to be drilled. Next, I needed to cut the groove for the bolt that goes between the clamping surfaces. I made several shallow passes, ensuring the bit was not biting too much. Time to test fit the zip bolts and see how well they work. They did quite well at pulling the two pieces together. Now that the sections could be mechanically bonded together, it was time to make them meet in an aesthetically pleasing way and fill some of the cracks. I used an angle grinder with a Cuts-All extreme disc, hand files, rotary tool with Cuts-All burrs, and a 5-inch disc sander. The Cuts-All tools made this process quick and easy, and we are very happy with the end result. A little bit of fine tuning with a Cuts-All burr before moving to the disc sander. The disc was 80 grit 3M extract Cubitron and did quite well at smoothing the rough edges. These are before and after shaping pictures. Now that one of the easier joints was shaped, it was time to move on to a more difficult task. We took it slow and steady because we only had one shot at this. We think all of the joints ended up looking like smooth driftwood. The next task was another first for us. We used tinted epoxy to fill the cracks and the large void at the middle of the center slab. The epoxy we chose had a long working time, which afforded us the ability to be careful and precise. We were pleased with the immediate results prior to letting the epoxy cure. Those are not bubbles in the epoxy. It is a fine amount of glitter that reflects the light quite well. Removing the tape was a moment of excitement and truth for us. Our goal was to retain the natural look and texture of the wood, but also allow the slabs to be secure. We think everything went very well and we're ready to move on to more sanding in order to level the epoxy and remove excess. The underside needed very little cleaning up and a small amount of leveling. We were excited to see what the end result may look like, so we dusted off the surface and applied some denatured alcohol. We were quite nervous about how to fill the void with epoxy, but we think it turned out quite well and would be even better with some wet sanding and polishing. We moved on to shaping the two ends. This was a move slowly and check often process while removing the material. Once again, we were very happy with the results. Now for the other end, which was a bit more complicated due to the branch section we were keeping. This end turned out beautiful due to the texture, colors, and soft edges. More sanding in order to smooth out any rough edges or leftover penetrating epoxy on the sides of the slabs. Nearing the end of the project, but first we needed to carefully lay out the C-channel and route out the material for the channel to fit flush within the bottom of the slabs. With all 8 of the C-channel areas cut out, allowing them to be flush with the bottom, the steel inserts went in next. I used a transfer punch to mark the exact location of each insert. Then I drilled the holes and installed the insert by hand. I sanded the bottom side of the 3 slabs to 120 grit and applied the oil-based polyurethane. We used a Varathane floor polyurethane in a gloss finish after having amazing results in durability with it on an oak dining table a few years ago. Time to sand and finish the top side. I used 80, 120, 180, 240, 320, 400, and 600 grit sandpaper. I knew this was overkill, but I wanted to be sure to have the smoothest surface possible for the polyurethane to be applied to. I can say without a doubt I made the right choice. I was sure to blow off the dust between grits, just for good measure. A good double wash and rinse with denatured alcohol was the last step before applying the polyurethane to the top surface. Finally, the last step, applying the polyurethane to the top surface. I applied 5 coats in total, with at least 24 hours cure time between coats. I also sanded with 1000 grit discs between the coats. After the final coat of polyurethane, I used Meguiar's Ultimate Polishing Compound and wax with a Porter Cable random orbital buffer. This left a very smooth and glossy finish on the surface. The oil-based polyurethane allows the natural beauty of the wood and the surface imperfections to be present instead of covered up. This is the finish we were going for. Since this was our first live edge project, we took our time and verified each step before proceeding on with it. In the end, we could not be happier with every aspect about the live edge bar top, from the purchasing at M2 Lumber to bolting it down. What an adventure, and we are already looking forward to our next live edge project for our home. Well, that's it. Thanks for stopping by our channel to watch our video.